So after 4 years of studying story, I eventually came to this model, which I call the full circle model, to help us figure out the critical points that you need to have in a story to make it the most dynamic and full. Now, there are so many subgroups and subtopics of scene development, character development, and other just parts of story to make it into a crafted piece of work. But this just focuses on the 11 most fundamental things that you should at least consider in your story to help you clarify what you're trying to say that is in your mind. So to start with the first circle, I have it called the critical problem. This pretty much is the reason why the story exists. There's a problem that has to be solved. And so obviously the next bubble would be the essential solution. These are just your two fundamental things that need to be understood. And I will go through with an example, a couple of examples later on. All right, so after the essential solution, I branch off into two different subcategories. And these affect the essential solution because our story is trying to figure out how to get to the solution so that the critical problem can be solved and thus the resolution can come afterward. I'm going to focus first on the main character external obstacle. So we have the dominant obstacle. And what this is that this is a constant obstacle throughout the story that the main character has to figure out how to deal with. And the next bubble is, what does the main character do about the dominant obstacle? Dominant obstacle. And you're going to see that this bubble is also highlighted with the personal struggle because these two are interconnected with each other. The reason, or the main character's first choice, how to overcome the main dominant obstacle, is motivated by their personal struggle. And I'll give you examples of that in a moment. And so now you get to explain why did it not work and what ends up working to overcome this dominant obstacle. What you're doing here is creating that flaw and making it visible for people to see so that we also get to experience a change in your character, which actually bonds us with them. All right, so then now we have to the other side, the personal struggle. This one is just simply, as you've probably heard, the flaw within the character. And it's going to affect some of their decisions, just like the dominant obstacle. What are they going to do to overcome that obstacle? And this personal struggle is going to keep them from also the essential solution. As you can see in the second bubble, how does this hinder from the essential solution? And when you see that all these are connected in a way, you want to make sure that your thoughts are congruent with each other and they're not just random bits and pieces. They all have a connective piece to them. And so how does it hinder for the essential solution? If you start, let's say, like if you have the obstacle or the personal struggle being fear, and yet the overall idea about the story has nothing to do with fear, you start to counteract ideas against each other and not creating a strong webbed story. Last bubble at the main character internal obstacle is how and when is main character free from the personal struggle. This whole section is actually the story of your story because there's plot versus story, and this is going to be when your character finally overcomes that personal struggle. They'd freed themselves from this bondage that somehow had grown inside of them, and they're now liberated. All right, and so now the 4 separate bubbles that are in dotted lines, these are kind of just some things to think about. So the first one I'm going to go to is what personal and universal need is at risk if the essential solution fails. So what the thing is here is that you want your outcome of the story to both be personal to the main character, but also have a ripple effect to a greater cause or effect outside of the main character. And I'll give an example of that in a little bit, but you want to make sure that this happens so that there's more meaning and purpose for what exactly that the main character that we're following, what they are a part of is something greater than themselves. All right, so then the dramatic question The thing about the dramatic question is a lot of people like to have the dramatic question very closely tied in with the immediate story. The thing about the dramatic question, it's not so much tied into the immediate story, but it's like a historical change that is happening, and the story that we're being a part of is one of the stories that is a part of a greater event or historical change that's happening. And it doesn't have to be like so grand, but it could just be, let me tell you the time about this time when we saved the farm. And it could be personal and closer like that, or it can be about, will the American people win the Revolutionary War or something like that. But we follow a very personal story that's a part of a greater dramatic question. And I'll give you an example in a little bit. And so then we also have how the story begins and how it ends. This is just very important to make sure that you have your idea solidified and how you want us to start and how you want us to end, because you may want us to be in the same place, just having that full circle. And when you have the same, like, either setting or whatnot at the very end, you have given us this growth. So like when the hobbits come back to the Shire, for instance, there is, you don't see the Shire the same way from when you first left. But yeah, think of other stories where just imagine, or just think of how they started the story and then think of how they ended it. It is very crucial in just trying to clarify what you're really trying to say. All right, so let's go over some of the examples. The first one I want to do is Gladiator, and then I'm going to do Lord of the Rings. So with the Gladiator one, the critical problem is that Commodus is emperor, and the essential solution is, well, he needs to not be emperor. It really, like, those two are the most simple ones, but it's interesting how people can't really even figure out the most critical goal of their story, and thus everything is kind of an amoeba and not really satisfying a central idea. So Commodus needs to go, basically. So if we go to the dominant obstacle, when we start following our main character, Maximus is a gladiator. He is thrown into slavery. And so that is his dominant obstacle that he has to overcome throughout the whole entire story. And so what does he do about the dominant obstacle? If you remember, he actually gives up, which ties into his personal struggle. Because his family was murdered, and there's no hope into having this. He's now in a foreign country. Rome is lost. There's nothing he can do other than just give up and die. I mean, that's kind of his, if you remember that. And so, but it did not, of course it did not. Why did it not work? Well, it's because if he continued that way, he would eventually just die in the ring, and well, that would have been a short story. But what ends up working, and if you guys remember, he was given an opportunity that, hey, we might go to Rome and fight before the emperor. And then he's like, ooh, I want to fight before the emperor, but it's because he has this internal motive, and that makes him change as a character from passive to active, and he's charging the dominant obstacle with everything he has, because he has to overcome that in order to get to that essential solution, thus resolving the story. Now, we go over to the other side with the main character internal obstacle. His personal struggle, I would have to say, is hopelessness, and that just desolate feeling of what's the point of pursuing this anymore. But at the same time, you can even call it even failure, because he was not able to become what Max, I forgot. All their names sound so familiar, but the former emperor wanted him to be emperor instead of his son, and so he was not able to fulfill those wishes of that former emperor. And so you can also maybe even add in that he feels like he has failed and whatnot. And so and then he also failed trying to get to his family. So it's just lots of failure, hopelessness, and just that depressive state. And so that's going to be his personal struggle, finding that liberation from those feelings. And that's going to, influence his some of his decisions. And so how does this hinder from the essential solution? It hinders it because he simply just will give up. and he's more susceptible to giving up if the goal seems more and more dark and hopeless. And we got to see that when he was first captured and thrown into prison, basically as a slave. And so when is he finally liberated? So like, how and when is the main character free from this personal struggle? And it's when he dies, but also kills Commodus, and he reunites with his family once again. And that's when he finally is freed from that hopelessness and that depressive state, because he, one, saved Rome, and two, justified his family's death, and I guess even three, now gets to be with them forever, which, if you kind of remember, at the very beginning, he starts with being in the field, and so there's it's really important to remember what kind of first scene. I know that's a different bubble, but remember what your first scene is, or shot is, or even in a book, just like, what are you first expressing to us? So that's when he's finally freed from that. So what personal and universal need is at risk if the essential solution fails? So the personal issue for him is that his family may never be justified. They would have a death from this criminal, and this criminal will never pay for what he has done. But the universal need is that Rome would become an empire, and by the how it was set up, would ultimately fail. And so it has, the essential solution has to happen in order for Rome to become structured and safe and from falling apart. So what's really important about this is recognizing what's personal about your character in this situation, because it's going to want us to dive in and want that for them. And the universal part is just kind of the greater part that the main character got to be a part of. So it's just really cool to see how their actions ended up changing a greater cause. And so, what is the dramatic question? The dramatic question is actually, is Rome going to be ruled under an empire or under a senate? They expressed this dramatic question when Maximus and Commodus were in the tents right after the big battle, the beginning of the scene, and one of the council members comes up to him and says, "What do you think, Maximus, emperor or senate?" And really, the whole story is out to answer that question, because if you remember how I explained it at first, the Maximus Gladiator story is actually a strand of story in a greater historical moment. So you could have had a whole story about Proximo or Senator Gracchus. You could have followed any of them and had a whole different story, but the central question could have been the same. And so when you have your story, think of what historical moment is your story taking part of, and that's going to answer ultimately that full dramatic question. The dramatic question is not like, will Frodo throw the ring into Mordor, or throw the ring into Mount Doom? That's not the dramatic question. I'll tell you what that is in a second. It's not, will Commodus, die, or will Maximus have his revenge? That is not the dramatic question. However, those are good to have because it makes us wonder what's going on. But the real dramatic question is this historical change of events that the story is being a part of. All right, and so how does the story begin? We have Maximus walking through the field, the wheat field. However, we do end with seeing the city of Rome, but that does go to point about Rome being free once again. But they do try to tie in death of Maximus and his freedom as well as the Roman freedom. And so they kind of put those together, but they finally end with Rome. And so if that's kind of how you know that that's kind of the greater issue at hand here, was the success of Rome. All right, so I'm going to go over now Lord of the Rings. This one's going to be a little bit different because it's not different, but there are some very deep things about Lord of the Rings. And so hopefully this allows you to see how interesting it can really be, and that this model really does help. So, critical problem. Well, obviously, the ring survived. And so the essential solution is that the ring must be destroyed. Very simple, very simple. All right, so now we're going to go to the dominant obstacle. All right, the difficult thing about Lord of the Rings is that there's so many cast members, and then you can almost have a separate thing for each one. But we're going to focus on Frodo because yes, he is the more of the main focus of the story, while there still are many other characters involved. But the dominant obstacle for Frodo is what? The ring is seductive, and that is something that he has to fight throughout the whole entire story. And so now, what does he do? What does he do about the dominant obstacle? And this is going to tie into the personal struggle, and I will defend the personal struggle of what I think it is in a second. But, what he does is he follows everyone's opinion about to own a ring of power is to be alone or something like that. And so he chooses to be alone in this circumstance and to pursue it with no help. And why does it not work? And I guess there isn't like an actual outcome of why it didn't work. It was pretty much Tolkien going, no, Sam is going with him. I kind of find it as Tolkien's way of saying it's really important to have those very close relationships in life. And so I guess we can say, why would it not work? Because Frodo would have ultimately been tainted by the ring to the point where Gollum could have had his way with him. And so we could have seen how it would have not worked if Sam was not there. So what ends up working? Sam goes with him. So when we go to the personal struggle, now remember, the personal struggle and the dominant obstacle affect each other. And so the personal struggle with Frodo, I would have to say, is loneliness. It's a little harder to get in the movies because they had to just kind of skip along. They do say a couple things, but in the book, it focuses more on some of the just background story of the characters. And so with Frodo, if you look through his life, you have his parents drowned. It's like the worst way to die, basically. And then a little bit later, he is adopted by an uncle who doesn't really care about him, but he wanted an heir because he didn't want to give his possessions to the Sackville Bagginses. And so out of relations, if you remember in the movie, that's why he adopted Frodo, and they have the same birthday and whatnot, but there really isn't a connection there. But then you end up having Bilbo leaving him, not really saying anything, just disappearing and leaving. That's pretty much it. And then a little bit later, you start to have Gandalf leaving him. He dies, and he's a very important key character to Frodo, but then he leaves him. And then you have the Fellowship breaking up because of him, and now they're leaving him and abandoning him. And even so seems that Sam is part of that struggle. And so you just see this motif of loneliness and almost, or just everyone important to Frodo is being left away. And so this loneliness influenced him to be like, okay, because I've been in this situation, I understand I do need to be alone. But Sam coming in, I really do think, is Tolkien reminding himself almost. Because I don't know Tolkien's life very much, but part of me wonders if that loneliness kind of reflects his personal life, and Sam is maybe his reminding himself of how important it is to really do have those relationships. So then how does this hinder from the essential solution? Well, the ring, because it is so seductive, it knows the heart of our problems. And so that's why I would have to say at the very end, when Frodo is about to toss it in and he doesn't, well, why didn't he toss it in? Well, it's because it is another thing that he has to let go, another thing that's important to him, or a person. I mean, the ring's not a person, but the ring has been there with him all along through all of these struggles and all this whole journey. And at the very end, just like everyone else that he had to leave in life, or that left him, he has to choose to leave the ring. And that's why it overcame him, because that the ring knew his deepest personal struggle. Tolkien was a genius. And so that's why, or that's how it hinders the essential solution. And so when is Frodo Baggins finally freed from this personal struggle? Well, that is why the Grey Havens were there. Because he just because of all that hurt and pain, there was no place here for him to rest his head. And even though the ring is finally destroyed, there are hurts in him that are far beyond carrying, and so him going to the Grey Havens is when he finally has that really big grin and leaves and whatnot. So it's really very powerful. All right, so now going to the personal and universal need, what the risks are if the essential solution does not succeed. Well, personally for Frodo, it's the Shire. He doesn't care about Gondor. He doesn't care about these other places. He doesn't know about these other places. But he goes. If you remember at the very end, we went out to save the Shire, Sam, and Shire, Baggins, well, I'll leave him here, and all that stuff, and that alludes to his personal, like, he wants to save his home. But universally, he also is saving basically the world, or Middle Earth, so to speak. And so everyone else is affected by his pursuing. And so you want your main characters to have that honorable outcome, I guess I could say. So what is the dramatic question? So this one is a little funky. It's kind of said in the movies, but definitely in the books. And it's all through Gandalf. Gandalf's talking about in the movies, like, it is in men that we'll place our hope. And in the very end of the movie, he says, my task is now complete. And like, well, what task? Well, it doesn't say in the movies, but in the books, it says that his whole point of being there was to usher in the race of men to the next age. Age. And so really the dramatic question of the Lord of the Rings is, will the race of men succeed into the next age? Really, that's it. So that is the historical moment or movement that this story is, well, many stories within all the different timelines, timelines and plot lines. That is what they are taken a part of, and especially, I guess, Aragorn is a really good example of just showing that him being king and mankind needs to rise up, because elves are leaving and the dwarves are dwindling, and the hobbits eventually, I think they kind of disappear, if I remember right, if I remember the lore right. But men need to take up this next era, and so really the dramatic question is that, and it's not always so obvious in the story. But yeah, it's the historical moment that the story is being a part of. And so how does the story begin? How does it end? And it's a little difficult because in the movies they have a prologue and in the books they don't. And so, but it's pretty important to recognize, like, the story doesn't really begin until the Shire. And because when we finally end, we are in the Shire. And so, and all the things in between really change us as people. And so one of my favorite scenes in there is when all the hobbits are sitting around the table after they came back from their great adventure and looked at each other, and it's like the most powerful scene with no words, just because how do you come back to this life and whatnot. And so it's just beautiful. I love that movie so much, or a series or trilogy or whatever. But it's really important to know, like, where are you starting and where are you ending, because what that's doing is affecting how we see and grow through the story. You don't have to know it right off the bat, but you can at least kind of fiddle around and find what's the best beginning and what's the best ending. So I really hope that is helpful for you guys. You can download this model in the description below. This is just something that I created because I found that this is really helpful just to be able to clarify your thoughts, especially if you struggle with trying to get things in an order so you can express the great imagination in your mind. So let me know if you guys think this is helpful, and I will see you guys in another video.